Greetings, and welcome to Bumbling Through Dungeons. Today we're talking about something that has nothing to do with my deep voice. Today we're talking about elements of the game that are unbalanced, and how that can be a strength rather than a weakness. Hey guys, welcome to BTD. Mark here, and today we're talking about things that are unbalanced. So, one of the biggest complaints that you're going to hear about any game online that is at all competitive or that any number of people participate in is how OP or overpowered certain things are, or how imbalanced or unbalanced certain aspects of the game are. Now, I think that there's this obsession with balancing classes and races and roles and powers and abilities and spells, and it's impossible. It's impossible, first of all, to balance everything, but second of all, I think even if we could balance everything perfectly in a game like D&D, and I've played others where these complaints are voiced by many people, I'm not sure it would be ideal. So I do think that there is a conceptual divide between a game like D&D and a game like, say, World of Warcraft, where I, for many years, got to hear complaints along the same lines, like, oh, this class is so OP, you just do this and you do top DPS and you don't even have to try. And sometimes those complaints were correct, sometimes there was something to them, other times there weren't. And that was a game that was highly competitive, and a lot of the central elements were about those balancing issues. In D&D, I don't think that's the case. The point is to have fun. Nobody is playing competitive D&D and saying, haha, our group did more damage in this round than yours, who are the same level. That doesn't really exist, and I think that's a really good thing, because the game doesn't really allow for that type of balance because of how many insane variables can be added into even mundane encounters. I also think that a lot of times when people will point to the mathematical imbalances of certain spells or abilities or classes or certain types of builds, it largely exists in the abstract. And once you get to the table and you're rolling dice, a lot of it is random. And so somebody in any given week where you're playing or in any given campaign is going to do the most damage, is going to be the most powerful in a particular setting, but it's not necessarily because they're playing the most powerful class. A lot of it might be due to where the setting is. If you have a holy priest in the realm of the dead, obviously they're going to have certain uses that other classes, other roles won't. That's not necessarily because they're overpowered. That's very particular to that setting. Other times it's just due to things like dice rolls or random loot rolls. They might get something that's really beneficial to them, whereas the others don't, and it ends up making them a smidge more powerful. And I think that as long as everyone is an adult at the table or acts as an adult at the table, that these sorts of imbalances aren't really an issue, or they shouldn't be. But I do want to talk about a few specific instances where there are very pronounced imbalances in certain aspects of the game. Not where I think the game's broken, but I think where if something like this happens and say one party member, for whatever reason, is much more powerful or much more useful than the others in the group, what do you do? And is it a problem? We're going to talk about that today. We're also going to talk about other types of imbalances. Say you have a group and all of them want to play the same class, and they're all going to have a lot of these same types of skills. Is that imbalanced? Is it a problem? How do you handle it? We're going to talk about that today. And do you have a really powerful group of adventurers that through some means is really more powerful than the world around them and doesn't have a lot that's going to be challenging them? And this could happen in a homebrew world where you don't want to shoehorn in harder challenges for them into a setting where it doesn't make sense. It could also happen in pre-generated adventures where somehow they end up in an area and they're much higher level than they should be for it. Is this a problem? And how do you deal with it? We're going to talk about that today too. So if one particular character is more powerful than the others for some reason or other, or more useful than the others, I think there's an instinct to nerf them, to bump them down a notch or bump the others up a notch to try to close that gap. And certainly that is the tactic that a lot of DMs do, and it can be done really well, and you can sort of balance things out so that everyone, even if things aren't completely equitable after that, at least it feels more equitable and everybody's happy. But I'm not so sure that it's the best thing, at least in the short term, if you have one of these characters who, for whatever reason, is much more useful or more powerful. Because that's an opportunity to shine the spotlight on that character that maybe they're not expecting, and maybe they realize isn't the greatest thing to happen to them once they have that spotlight on them. So what is the price of that power? What is the price of that fame? These are the questions that I would start to ask. Are they starting to attract the attention of darker, more powerful forces? And is it them in particular that is starting to attract that attention and not the rest of the party? How might that affect that character? Similarly, if one person becomes the face of the group and they're the most powerful and they get all the glory and the others don't, the others might start to resent that until they see that all of the townsfolk or all of the city is lavishing praise to a point where they're just this celebrity who doesn't have a lot of perks and just has a lot of people annoying them all the time. Imagine something like the paparazzi in D&D. How might that affect a player who gets more than their fair share of glory? And I don't think I would punish this player for too long like that. I would find some way to mitigate it and probably return it to something like normal. But I think this might actually be a real interesting role-playing experience for both that player and the rest of the group. So we're talking about overpowered stuff, but we can also talk about imbalance in terms of being underpowered. And I think this can be really interesting too. And a lot of DMs are actually very fond of throwing their players into settings and into encounters where they are overmatched. And as long as you make it clear somehow to your players, either out of game by just stating that they're going to have to run away from some encounters and find other ways to tackle problems, or in game by giving them a lot of foreshadowing and clues to that effect, I think it's important to communicate there, but I think you can have an entire world that is just more powerful than the characters who are trying to survive in it. There's a whole subgenre called survival horror to describe games like this. I think the setting of Dark Sun is very much created like this, where the task of just surviving is enough of a quest for many groups, because trying to make it in this harsh world is something of a challenge in and of itself. So now let's say the party is lopsided in a particular direction. They have a lot of healers or a lot of melee people or a lot of spellcasters. They'll have certain strengths, but that will also include certain weaknesses and flaws, so they won't be a balanced party. They will be imbalanced. So I still hear a lot of players talk about this, like, oh my goodness, we're not going to have a healer. What are we going to do without a healer? Or, oh, we're very spellcaster heavy, but we don't have a tank. So if this person goes down, we're going to TPK. And 5th edition is, I think, much more forgiving than past editions in this sense. And I don't know for sure whether or not you could get away with a party of, say, all one class in 1st edition. But I do know that in 5th edition, I've heard multiple stories of this where you'll have a party of all bards or druids or anything really. And you can fill a particular niche, a particular role, even with someone else who is ostensibly doing the same type of thing. And you can do this through the archetype that you choose, or even just how you choose to roleplay the character. So as a player, I don't necessarily think this is a problem, as long as you're all able to find your place within the group, within the party. It all feels like you have something to contribute, either in a role-playing sense, in a combat sense, or in both. And as a DM, I actually do think this is an opportunity, because if a group doesn't have a healer, do you give them NPC allies? Are you a benevolent DM and you give them NPC allies who are healers to fill that role in the party so that they feel a little bit better about their chances? Or do you not? Do you make it so they don't have access to healing potions or healers, and you sort of lean into that to put them a little bit on edge about the fact that they don't have much healing magic? I think you could take this to an extreme and say you have a group, and I've heard of these again, we just talked about some of them. So I have a group of friends who have a party of, they call it the Bardy, and it is 5, I think it's 5, it might be 4, but it's all bards. And bards are a versatile class, but you are still going to have some gaps. And the DM for that group just lets them roll with it. They are a traveling band of adventurers, and band in a very literal sense, in that they are also a musical band. And if you had, say, a full party of rogues, I would probably just lean into something like that as well. Obviously, you're going to be light on spell casting, although you can choose an archetype that will give you some spells, and you are going to have noticeable gaps in what you can and can't do. But at the same time, they're going to have a lot of cool skills, and I would probably create some quest hooks that would allow them to solve things very sneakily. You know, if they wanted to be a D&D version of Ocean's 11 and just steal a bunch of stuff, I think that'd be awesome. And if I'm playing, say, a pre-gen adventure that doesn't necessarily have a lot of things set up for a party like that, then I would probably just try to take some of the existing encounters and find ways that they could utilize their skills to tackle the problem in a different way. So it would require a little bit of extra work, but I don't think it would break any of the encounters or the adventure for them to try it. So in any of these cases, I think you could lean into or away from the imbalance within the party, or in relation to the world, or in relation to other members of the party, or if they're just lopsided towards certain types of skills and away from others. And those are going to be unique experiences. You know, how often do people see what other players are picking before they pick their own class so that they can have a balanced party? If the party really is imbalanced, I think that's a really cool opportunity for you to try some different things that maybe will go differently with this group of adventurers as opposed to one that is more balanced. And as a player, I don't think you need to do that. I don't think you need to be the one saying, oh, I'll see what everyone else picks and then I'll choose my class, because I want to make sure that we have everything represented with different types of damage and spells and healing and tanking and whatever other roles you think are necessary. That's very benevolent of you, but in 5th edition, I don't think it's necessary. I think there are a lot of different builds to the party and classes and roles that can work. And if you happen to find one that doesn't, I think it could be a heck of a lot of fun figuring that out too. And the last type of imbalance that I want to discuss is the player being imbalanced with themselves, or the character, I should say. So what I mean by this is, say you have a character who is a wizard, but then you roll up your stats and you actually make intelligence a really low stat. And I could see some very interesting role-playing reasons to do this. So this would certainly make your character less powerful. But you could be the aspiring wizard who was, there are a lot of archetypes of wizards that are bumbling, but this could take it to an extreme, and a wizard who isn't very successful and really wants to make it more than anything. And so it's sort of a desperate, pitiful chance for this person to be an adventurer, and then you slowly do start to improve. That would actually be a really cool thing to RP in my mind, because you're taking this character who by all rights shouldn't be a wizard, and through sheer determination over a long period of time, becoming an actual spellcaster, becoming a force to be reckoned with, knowing what it was like to be mocked or to be less powerful than their peers. So that is an interesting character arc. And you could actually build a character to be suboptimal in order to bring out some of those elements in role playing. If you want to do the most damage, if you want to be the most useful at the table, this isn't the way to go. But if the role-playing elements of the game appeal to you a little bit more, I think this is a really interesting avenue that you can consider. And then on the other hand, I know some characters and some players enjoy becoming just absolute masters at a small number of things and sort of ignore everything else. And this is very viable as well. So the character itself is a little imbalanced in that you have some things that are basically always going to succeed, but it's at the expense of other stats and abilities. And this can be cool too, because one, you are the absolute master of those. So you can feel supremely confident when you get a particular type of check, for example, and knowing that you're going to be without peer in this area. But it also means that there'll be plenty of things that you can't do well. And this is, again, another great role-playing opportunity, not for you, but for the other players. So this is a great chance for you to say, you know what, this isn't my thing. Let me step back, let someone else have the spotlight. So I think that the classes are sort of designed to do this anyway. Each class has its own sort of role and specialization, but there are some who feel like they can try or do anything and everything. And I think sometimes it's nice to say, you know what, I'm going to ignore that. I could become better at these other two, but let me just focus on what I'm really good at already. And that will be my niche. That'll be my role within the party. And you guys can have the spotlight for the other stuff. So this isn't an excuse to give one player all the great magic items and special abilities and shower them with all the praise for everything that the party does. I think that would be a recipe for disaster. But if you do find yourself with some of these situations, I don't necessarily think it's the end of the world, and I think a lot of them can be turned into opportunities. If we keep in mind that the goals really are create interesting, exciting stories and have fun, then I think it's pretty easy to see how some of these can be unique experiences. Because if everyone is relatively balanced, more or less, and you tell a lot of the same stories in a lot of the same ways, that's not as exciting to me. Finding the variations, finding the extremes on one side or the other can be just as interesting or more so to me, especially in contrast with what we consider normal, balanced play a lot of times. So this is why I oftentimes look to lean into my flaws as a character when I play in a game, and oftentimes where I look for these gaps in a party as a DM so that I can either exploit it in ways that will increase the tension for my party, or find ways to work around it so that they have challenges available to them that play to their particular strengths. Oftentimes I'm doing both over the course of a campaign. I also don't want to give the impression that I am completely happy with the balance of every class and every single spell and ability and build within 5th edition. I think there are some interesting imbalances that, were I a designer, I would probably focus on to find different solutions for. Fortunately, they're very, very limited, and I think on the whole, the designers do an amazing job with 5th edition, giving us a lot to work with in ways that never become so imbalanced that it breaks the game. But there are things that I have small issues with, and that isn't what this is about. This is just identifying those imbalances when they occur at your table and then figuring out how to make them work. So, do you agree? Do you disagree? Did I miss any ways that the party or a player can be imbalanced? And if those exist, how would you deal with them? Let me know down in the comments. I would be excited to hear that. And until the next video, take care.